Today, we uncover 5 shark attacks that turned deadly. From a man who deliberately reached out to feed a shark to a veteran diver in South Africa who followed every protocol and still vanished in a surge before the unexpected happened. But first, we begin with a dumb diver who ignored every warning and descended alone into depths he had no training to survive. It was March 7, 2014, and dive boats were preparing to depart from Dahab for an offshore Red Sea drift site with strict depth and buddy limits. That had been reinforced after numerous fatalities in offshore Red Sea incidents over the years. It was over 100 people. Derek Plum, 29, had limited recreational diving experience and had never descended beyond 30 feet. Divers that had met described him as someone who boasts about his experience. He had completed his open water PIATI certification 18 months earlier during a trip to Cancun, a 3-day course he had only partially finished before the instructor signed off on him. His logged dives since that certification numbered somewhere between 11 and 14, depending on whether he counted 2 pool sessions and 1 incident in an Indiana lake where he had panicked and been pulled to shore by a passing kayaker. He had never dived deeper than 30 feet. He had found videos of offshore Red Sea blue water drift dives through YouTube and booked a budget trip to Egypt the same week, telling friends it was a bucket list item. He had no technical diving training, no dive computer, and he arranged to rent equipment from the cheapest operation he could find. He arrived at the marina at 8:15 a.m. carrying a rental tank, a borrowed BCD that did not fit his torso, a wetsuit 2 sizes too large, and no original certification card, claiming instead that he was a professional level diver who had simply forgotten his certificate at home. The dive master examined Derek's gear and asked him a series of pointed questions. Derek said he had logged around 40 dives and described himself as effectively professional. When asked to produce his certification card, he said he had forgotten it, but insisted he was highly experienced. The dive master reminded the group that the maximum depth was 98 feet and that no one was to separate from the group. Derek nodded and entered the water with the group. The descent line dropped alongside a reef edge where the coral shelf transitioned sharply into deep cobalt water. The visibility was extraordinary, clear, warm water, with sunlight fading into indigo below and occasional silhouettes of tuna and barracuda passing at distance. Derek remained near the group for approximately 5 minutes before drifting slightly deeper along the wall for no good reason but his ego. He passed 130 feet without a depth gauge or decompression plan and was now well below the group. At approximately 165 feet, as the reef wall dissolved into open blue, a large oceanic white-tip shark appeared below him, a species documented in the offshore Red Sea for bold investigative behavior toward divers in open water. It was just circling around. It did not rush him. Oceanic white-tips are known for persistent, investigative circling in open water and often approach from below, using the silhouette of prey against the surface light. It circled once at a distance of several yards, maintaining eye contact as it passed through the edge of his peripheral vision. A trained diver would have flattened out, faced the shark, and begun a slow ascent toward the reef. Derek did the opposite. He jerked. Before he fully processed what was happening, the shark, reacting to his sudden erratic movement in open blue water, tightened its circling pattern and made a closer pass from below and to the right. Derek twisted awkwardly in the water column, kicking toward open blue instead of the reef. On the next pass, the shark accelerated upward in what investigators later described as an investigative strike, brushing his right thigh with its snout before its jaws closed over his outer thigh and hip. The bite tore through the neoprene wetsuit and deep into muscle and tissue. The force of the impact spun him sideways in the water column and drove his regulator from his mouth. The shark veered away, but did not fully retreat, circling again at close range as he struggled. Disoriented, bleeding heavily, and already cognitively impaired from depth and stress, he was unable to recover the regulator before aspirating seawater. When the dive master realized Derek was missing, a search was initiated. His body was later located at approximately 175 feet near the base of the drop-off, with a severe thigh wound consistent with a single major shark bite and additional tissue damage likely sustained after he lost consciousness. Retrieval required a separate technical dive team with appropriate deep diving equipment the following day, along with coordinated support from the boat crew due to the depth and current conditions. The official report listed drowning at extreme depth following separation from the group as the cause of death, with contributing factors including nitrogen narcosis, lack of depth monitoring, and exceeding certified limits. No wrongdoing was found by the dive operator. Local dive operators reiterated mandatory buddy enforcement, physical verification of certification cards before departure, strict adherence to the 30-meter recreational limit, and tighter group cohesion protocols during blue water drifts. But as catastrophically avoidable as Derek Plum's death had been, the next story involved a man who hadn't stumbled into danger by accident, but had walked into it deliberately, and he had brought his own bait. It was June 14, 2018, in Islamorada, Florida Keys, and the water off Islamorada was doing what it always does in early summer, flat and blue and indifferent. The kind of morning that makes bad decisions feel like good ones. Marcus Obeya, 34, was an experienced freediver and spearfisher from Miami who had increasingly begun diving alone and pushing deeper breath hold limits, and he had grown dismissive of the most basic rule in spearfishing. You do not keep bleeding fish on your body while you keep diving in waters known for bull sharks and hammerheads. You put your catch in a float bag, tethered at the surface. Divers who had told him as much described being brushed off with the patient condescension of a man who believed his experience had made him exempt. He paddled out alone to his preferred reef spot at around 7:30 a.m. The reef sat in 18 to 22 feet of water, known for grouper and snapper. Within the first 30 minutes, he had shot 2 yellowtail snapper and clipped them to a short wire stringer on a D-ring at his left hip. Both fish were alive and bleeding. Bull sharks are common in the Florida Keys and are known to respond quickly to the scent of bleeding fish. Bull sharks have one of the highest bite forces recorded among sharks of comparable size, aided by a stocky body and short, broad snout designed for high-impact strikes. A wire stringer of dying snapper clipped to a free-diving human in a Florida reef system is not an ambiguous situation for a bull shark. It is a food source. The 2 sharks that appeared around 8:20 a.m. had probably been tracking the blood trail for several minutes before Marcus noticed the first one. A large bull moving in slow, deliberate arcs along the reef structure about 25 feet below him. He spotted it on his descent. He recognized immediately what it was and what it meant. He decided to ascend carefully. He didn't know there was a second one. The second bull had been tracking the blood plume from the opposite direction, approaching from behind and below at an angle Marcus had no way to see. It covered the last 15 feet at full speed. Marcus was at approximately 12 feet of depth when 300 pounds of shark hit him in the left side like a thrown vehicle. 2 ribs fractured on impact. The force drove him sideways through the water, his mask flooding, his spear gun torn from his grip. The shark's momentum carried it past him, but it circled back in less than 2 seconds, its jaws already open. It bit down on his left hip, jaws closing around the wire stringer, the 2 snapper, and the section of wetsuit and flesh beneath them. The stringer snapped. The shark pulled away with the fish, the D-ring hardware, a ragged section of his 3mm wetsuit, and a significant portion of the soft tissue of his left hip and outer thigh. The femoral artery was not severed in that bite. He was thrashing now. He couldn't help it. The pain and the shock and the flood of adrenaline made controlled movement impossible. The first bull shark, which had been circling the reef structure below during the initial attack, responded to the blood and the thrashing. It came up fast and hit Marcus from the front, jaws closing around his right forearm and lower bicep as he reached toward the surface. He felt the teeth and then felt the pull as the shark twisted its body. 2 fingers were gone when the shark released. A significant portion of his forearm went with it. Marcus reached the surface, screaming. A nearby fishing vessel responded to Marcus's screams and pulled him aboard. The Coast Guard arrived within minutes, and he was airlifted to a trauma center in Miami. He died during surgery 6 hours later from massive blood loss caused by vascular trauma to his left thigh. The authorities responded to the site that afternoon. 2 bull sharks were observed in the vicinity, but neither was captured. They issued a 72-hour public advisory recommending divers avoid the reef. Marcus's family sued the kayak rental company that had launched him that morning, alleging inadequate safety briefing, but it was dismissed. Marcus Obeya lost his life, ignoring the basic rule. But in the Bahamas, a man named Cole Arnett wasn't hunting sharks or diving past his limits. He decided to feed the sharks. It was November 3rd, 2018, in New Providence, Bahamas, and the water off the western coast of New Providence was the kind of clear, warm, brilliant turquoise that makes people forget that things can go wrong. A dive boat rocked in the mild chop about a mile offshore. 9 passengers in full dive gear hung off the ladder and the rail, listening to their guide run through the pre-dive briefing for the 3rd time in as many minutes, because one of their group had not been listening. Cole Arnett was 41 years old, a structural engineer from Atlanta who prided himself on risk assessment. He was not generally considered reckless, but on this trip he dismissed established safety protocols. At work, on vacation, Cole operated under a different framework, one he described to his dive buddy, a colleague, as calculated spontaneity. Cole had booked a commercial shark dive, a legitimate, popular, widely operated activity in the Bahamas. During these controlled dives, divers kneel in a fixed line while trained guides manage shark feeding from a secured crate. The dive master had been running shark dives in these waters for 8 years. She had been explicit during the briefing. Divers would kneel in a designated line. No one was to move from that line once the sharks arrived. No one was to extend their arms toward the sharks, and no one was to break position without signaling her first. She demonstrated the correct arm position 3 times. Cole smiled and gave a thumbs up. The dive began at 10:40 a.m. The dive master descended first with her assistant and positioned the shark crate. The Caribbean reef sharks arrived within 2 minutes. Caribbean reef sharks exhibit a documented feeding response hierarchy. When food is present, they prioritize the shortest, most direct path to the source. In feeding scenarios, an obstruction placed between shark and bait is often treated as an object to remove, not evaluate. 7 individuals, ranging from about 5 to 8 feet in length, moved in the loose, gliding, figure 8 patterns, characteristic of this species during a feeding event. The control mechanism keeping this dive safe was simple: a line of stationary, non-threatening, arms-in divers who did not disrupt the shark's behavioral pattern. Remove the control, and you are simply a group of people in the water with 7 agitated sharks and a box of fish. Cole broke position at approximately 10:53 a.m., 13 minutes into the dive. He had spotted a large female reef shark moving in a wide arc toward the crate, and had done what people with no shark diving experience do when they see something that interests them. He reached out. He extended his right arm fully, glove open, palm facing the shark, a piece of fish pressed in his fist, the way someone might offer food to an animal they wanted to interact with. He had pocketed it from the surface before the dive. The extended arm placed his hand directly in the shark's approach path to the crate. The dive master saw him move and immediately kicked toward him, hand signals urgent and emphatic. She was 12 feet away. The shark was 6 feet away and already committed to its approach. The female reef shark, estimated at 7.5 feet and between 150 and 175 pounds, did not attack Cole out of predatory intent. What she did is exactly what reef sharks do when a large object is suddenly placed between them and their food source. She struck it. Her jaws opened and closed on Cole's right thigh. The shark released immediately and turned away. The bite was approximately 4 inches deep at the worst point, and the width of the wound tracked the full spread of the shark's jaws across his outer thigh. It was not a lethal bite. It was also not a small bite. The other sharks, responding to blood rapidly diffusing into the water column, became noticeably more agitated. The dive master had her hand on Cole's arm before the shark had fully cleared the area. She signaled the group to abort and began pushing Cole upward. The sharks followed the blood plume for the first 20 feet of the ascent. The assistant diver deterred the sharks by swimming directly at them and exhaling forcefully, breaking their approach. Cole broke the surface, bleeding heavily, and was hauled over the ladder by his dive buddy and the boat captain, tearing the skin around the wound wider in the process. A tourniquet was applied to his upper thigh within 2 minutes of reaching the deck. Paramedics arrived and he was transported to the hospital, where surgeons discovered that the bite had caused a deep, slashing laceration across the mid-thigh, partially transecting the superficial femoral artery and extensively damaging surrounding muscle and vascular structures. During surgery, acute compartment syndrome required a fasciotomy, and he underwent massive transfusion for blood loss. Although he initially stabilized after surgery, severe vascular injury and subsequent infection led to septic shock and multi-organ failure. He died 5 days after the dive. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as complications of traumatic vascular injury to the right thigh, including femoral artery laceration and subsequent septic shock. The manner of death was classified as accidental. The authorities reviewed the incident. The dive master cooperated fully with investigators and was cleared of any negligence. The dive operation suspended shark excursions for 2 weeks. The incident was classified as accidental, and no negligence was found by investigators. Cole Arnett died because he reached toward a shark that wasn't interested in him, and the ocean punished the gesture anyway. Meanwhile, a man in South Africa was not lucky enough to have anyone close enough to help. It was August 22nd, 2015, and the water off Shelly Beach was running cold, green, and murky, the way it does in midwinter on the KwaZulu-Natal coast. The surge was running at 6 to 10 feet. Visibility was poor. The sky was flat and gray in the way that makes the ocean look like it has no bottom. Paul Engelbrecht was 48 years old, a construction project manager from Pretoria with 16 years of diving behind him. His log showed more than 380 dives, including prior dives at Protea Banks, and he held advanced rescue and nitrox certifications. He had dived Protea Banks twice before. He knew the site. He understood its conditions and its risks. His wife described him as someone who was not reckless. He was simply a man who loved diving and had booked a week on a coast he knew well. The dive group that morning consisted of Paul, 6 other recreational divers, and 2 guides, a lead dive master with more than a decade of experience at Protea Banks, and an assistant guide. The pre-dive briefing covered current direction and expected surge, buddy assignments, torch signaling protocol if separated, regrouping procedures, and standard shark conduct. Paul was paired with another experienced diver, They descended together at the back of the group at 9:41 a.m. The descent was unremarkable. Visibility was 13 to 16 feet, poor but consistent with winter conditions at the site. The group reached the reef at 92 feet and began their traverse eastward along the pinnacle line. The separation happened at approximately 9:55 a.m., 14 minutes into the dive. A surge came through from the east. It hit the group without warning and scattered them off the reef line simultaneously. Paul's buddy grabbed the reef edge and held on, his torch beam swinging wildly through the disturbed water. When the surge passed and the sediment began to settle, he swept the beam in a full arc. Paul was nowhere to be found. The buddy held position for 30 seconds, sweeping his torch, looking for a light response. Nothing came back. He finned toward where Paul had been and swept again. Visibility had been reduced to 10 feet. He signaled toward the main group, which had regrouped around the lead dive master, and indicated a missing diver. Paul, separated and unable to reestablish contact, followed his training. He signaled with his torch. He waited 30 seconds. He signaled again. No response came. He checked his air and depth. 92 feet, bottom time 14 minutes, and made the decision to ascend. It was the correct decision. Bull sharks are commonly present at Protea banks during winter. They are large, fast, and capable of striking from below with minimal warning. Bull sharks are ambush capable and frequently approach from below and behind, using reduced visibility and vertical contrast to conceal approach. Somewhere between 20 and 15 meters of depth, Paul Engelbrecht was struck from below. The impact was immediate and disorienting. A large bull shark struck him from below and bit into the right side of his torso. There was no prolonged struggle. The force of the impact and the catastrophic damage to the thoracic cavity incapacitated him almost instantly. By the time the blood plume spread through the water column above the reef, the animal was gone. The lead dive master saw the blood cloud first, a dense, dark bloom appearing in the water column above and slightly east of the group's position. He signaled an immediate abort and began ascending. The assistant guide and two divers alongside him. They surfaced and observed blood dispersing on the current. There was no sign of Paul. The dive boat was alerted by radio. The captain brought the vessel to their position within 4 minutes and began a coordinated search of the surrounding water. Nothing was visible from the surface. A search operation was initiated through local marine rescue services. His body was recovered approximately 2.5 hours later along the projected drift line southeast of the reef. The coroner's report documented a single catastrophic bite wound to the right side of the torso, consistent with a large bull shark striking from below in an ambush posture. The strike had disrupted the right lung, major thoracic vessels, and the liver. The injuries were not survivable. Death was determined to have occurred within minutes of the strike due to rapid incapacitation from catastrophic thoracic injuries. A post-incident review conducted by the dive operator in cooperation with the shark's board found no negligence on the part of the crew. The separation was attributed to an unexpected surge event in already reduced visibility. The operator voluntarily suspended charters to Protea banks for 2 weeks following the incident and reinforced separation protocols in subsequent briefings. Paul was buried in Pretoria the following week. Paul Engelbrecht had done everything right, but while his body drifted southeast along the KwaZulu-Natal coast, a biology teacher who had spent 30 years preparing for everything encountered something unexpected. It was February 11th, 2014, and Kaanapali Beach on the island of Maui was living up to every photograph ever taken of it. The water was the color of liquid glass. The sand was white and fine enough to squeak underfoot. It was the kind of place that makes people feel safe in a way that has nothing to do with actual safety. Sandra Reyes was 52 years old, a high school biology teacher from San Antonio, Texas, who had spent 30 years teaching teenagers about the natural world, and had finally, as she told friends repeatedly in the months before this trip, decided to go see some of it for herself. Friends and colleagues described her as careful, thoughtful, and not inclined toward unnecessary risk. She had planned this trip for over a year. It was her 25th anniversary, and her husband Roberto had come along with the express intention of lying on the beach and reading historical fiction. Sandra had booked a series of reef snorkel excursions, a glass-bottom boat tour, and 1 scuba lesson. It was a vacation designed to be safe, relaxing, and memorable. She had read 3 books about Hawaiian marine ecosystems before departing. She had purchased her own mask, fins, and snorkel vest rather than renting because she had read that rental equipment fits poorly and that a poor fit is the leading source of discomfort for new snorkelers. She had practiced breathing through the snorkel in her bathtub. She was, in the truest sense, prepared. She had spent her first 2 days snorkeling from the beach inside the buoyed swim zone, delighted by everything she found, photographing triggerfish and parrotfish and sea turtles. On the morning of day 3, she joined a small group snorkel excursion run by a licensed operator. 8 guests, a 30-foot catamaran, a reef section approximately 1,312 feet offshore in water ranging from 15 to 20 feet deep. The guide briefed the group on the standard protocols. Stay within the designated area. Alert him if anyone felt uncomfortable. Do not touch the coral or marine life. He did not specifically address what to do if you found yourself between a resting shark and its escape route, because in 12 years of guiding, it had never come to that. The reef was exactly as beautiful as she had been promised. She spent 25 minutes moving slowly over the coral heads, watching a squadron of yellow tangs, a large Hawaiian grouper, and 2 spotted eagle rays that moved beneath her like slow, elegant kites. She was so still in the water that a juvenile Hawaiian angelfish came within 2 feet of her mask before deciding she wasn't interesting. She had been waiting 30 years for this. Every minute of it was worth the wait. She had drifted approximately 49 feet north of the main group while following a ray, the cluster signal. She lifted her head and saw the group drawing together, bodies tightening, the guide pointing toward the deeper water at the reef's edge. The tiger shark was large. Its length was 11 feet, possibly more. It was moving slowly along the reef's outer edge, unhurried, quartering back and forth in the systematic way tiger sharks patrol, covering ground the way an animal does when it is not fleeing and not chasing, but simply present. Tiger sharks possess heavily serrated teeth designed to shear through bone and dense tissue, which is why even a single investigative bite can result in catastrophic tissue loss. The guide had seen reef sharks many times. He had seen tiger sharks twice before, both times at distance, both times uneventful. He was not panicking. He was following protocol. He began moving the group toward the boat in a slow, controlled lateral arc, counting heads as they went. Sandra was at the group's outer edge. She had drifted 49 feet north following the ray. She was already swimming back toward the others when she made the error. Not a reckless error, not the error of someone who had stopped paying attention, but the invisible kind of error that happens when you are navigating by surface and something critical is happening below. She was swimming directly across the open water, between the reef edge and the boat, placing herself in the shark's patrol corridor. She did not know she had done it. There was no way to know. What happened next lasted only seconds. The tiger shark did not circle or posture. It rose from below and behind in a single, sudden movement. There was no warning, only the force of impact, as its jaws closed and released just as quickly. Tiger sharks often bite once and withdraw, and this one did exactly that, leaving a catastrophic wound before disappearing back into deeper water. The guide did not see the shark clearly. He saw the violent disturbance at the surface, and then the spreading red cloud in the clear water. Sandra remained afloat because of her snorkel vest, but the injury was immediately life-threatening. The bite had removed a substantial section of tissue from her midsection, the kind of massive trauma consistent with large tiger shark encounters. There was no practical way to control bleeding of that magnitude in open water. He reached her within seconds, securing her under the arms and pulling her toward the boat as the others scrambled aboard. She was unresponsive by the time they reached the transom. The captain was on the radio before she was fully out of the water, his voice steady in the practiced way of someone who has run emergency calls before and knows that steadiness on the radio is the only thing he can control right now. The guide began performing CPR immediately as they headed for shore. Resort medical staff met them at the waterline with a defibrillator. The air ambulance was in the air within 11 minutes of the emergency call reaching the dispatcher. Sandra was airlifted to a medical center and taken directly to theater. The surgical team worked for 2 hours. Sandra Reyes was pronounced dead at 12:14 p.m. The cause of death was listed as hemorrhagic shock, secondary to abdominal trauma from shark bite, with contributing damage to the mesenteric vasculature. She was 52 years old. Her husband was still on the beach when it happened. He had been on his 3rd chapter when a resort staff member walked toward him across the white sand with the expression people wear when they are carrying the worst news of someone's life. He was still holding his book. He told the one reporter who reached him at the airport 2 days later that Sandra had been the bravest person he had ever known, that she had died doing exactly what she had dreamed of doing, and that he was grateful and destroyed in equal measure. He did not answer any further questions. The guide took a leave of absence from the excursion company. The tiger shark was not located or removed. 6 months later, the authorities updated its guidelines to include mandatory pre-entry safety briefings covering the specific risk of drifting away from a guided group, and protocols for managing proximity to sharks along reef edges. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.